I recently posted a video on how to shoot with an 85mm lens that you all seemed to love. So today I'm going to talk about another one of my favorite prime lenses. It pairs great with the 85, you guessed it or read it on the title card. It's the 35mm lens. I'll share why the 35mm is so great for storytelling. I'll compare the 35mm prime to other favorites like the 50mm and the 16-35 zoom lens. And I'll tie it together with some tips for shooting with your 35, including some of my favorite composition techniques with real examples. I'm Brenda Bergering, giving you practical photography advice to complement Mark's gear reviews from our real world experience as a husband and wife photo video team. Hit subscribe, it helps us out. So first, why a 35mm? The 35mm prime lens is one of my most used lenses for a few different reasons. Number one, it's super lightweight and compact. And two, it's incredibly versatile. I use it for landscapes, portraits, adventures, weddings, travel, and just everyday life. I use it inside and outside, wide open and confined spaces. What makes the 35mm so versatile is that it's semi-wide, making it possible to capture a scene with a lot of context, even in tight spaces. However, it's not so wide that you'll notice a lot of unflattering distortion. So while the 85 is very flattering for portraits with this lack of distortion, as we learned in my last video, a lot of photographers use a 35mm for portraits too. I use this lens a lot at weddings because it's great for photojournalism, where you're photographing people, but you want more context in your photo than just a basic portrait. The 35 allows you to tell a bigger story by capturing some of the surrounding environment. We'll talk about that more in a minute with our shooting tips, but first let's compare the 35 to some other lenses. Another popular focal length is the 50mm. We have a previous video that dives into comparing the 35 and the 50 lens focal length and a blog post that I'll link below. But the long and short of it is this. Some people have a personal preference based on which focal length feels better or looks better, more natural to their eye. And so you might have a personal preference based on that. The 35 is more versatile in small spaces where you might not be able to move around a lot, but it also forces you to get closer to your subjects. 50mm can create a shallow depth of field and subject separation, whereas 35 has a wider depth of field and more of the scene in focus. 50mm is better for portrait photography when you want to set your subject apart, while the 35 is better for environmental portraits when you want to show the scene. Another option that some people love is the 28 f2. So this is a similar compact, lightweight size to the 35. It's just slightly wider. So if you find yourself thinking that the 35 is not quite wide enough, you might check out the 28. We love it because it's inexpensive and sharp in the center, so it makes a great option for similar things that you would use a 35 for. And then another option, if you're looking at the 35mm focal length, is one of my other favorites and other most used lenses, the 16-35mm zoom lens. Now, the 16-35 is much bigger and heavier than the 35, so it's not as easy to carry around all day if you're traveling. However, sometimes the 35 just isn't wide enough, as we talked about, for a landscape or an environmental portrait that I want to shoot. So sure, you can zoom with your feet and get further away from your subject with the 35 prime, as long as you have the space, but sometimes that wide perspective of the 16 immerses the viewer in the scene just a little more and makes the image a little more dramatic. What I love about the 16-35 is that I can shoot super wide landscapes as well as at that beautiful 35 focal length. Be sure to subscribe, as I'll dive more into this lens in a future video. But let's say you're sold on the 35 prime. You like how compact, lightweight, and versatile it is for shooting whatever you're planning to shoot. So let's talk through some tips for how to shoot with this lens. When shooting with the 35, try to get close to your subjects. I alluded to this before, but for some photographers, this takes practice because you don't want to invade their space. Luckily, this lens isn't very intimidating to your subject since it's small. So it's one of the less intimidating lenses to get close to your subjects with. And you'll notice that if you get close to your subject, the viewer of the photograph feels like they are there and present in the moment. And this is great storytelling. But as the photographer, that means you have to actually get close in and be present in the moment. So if you're shy, that is a challenge. If you're worried about the distortion of the 35, you'll want to keep your lens level and squared up to your subject and your subject away from the edges of the frame. The 35 is more forgiving than a 24-16 focal length. It generally has less distortion, but it's still important to pay attention to. Next, you want to be aware of your background in addition to your subject. Since the 35 is wide, whatever is behind your subject will be part of your photograph. That means you want to be intentional with your framing, choosing what to include and what to hide. If you need to hide something, move your body, get a lower perspective or higher perspective, shift right or left. Try hiding distracting elements behind your subject. And pay attention to where lines intersect. You don't want lines intersecting at weird places on your subject. You can also shoot through something and have your foreground hide the background. At low aperture, close foreground elements will be nicely blurred. And then this next tip applies to your photography in general, but when shooting with a 35 in particular, in addition to the intentional framing that I just talked about, you want to remember your composition techniques. Meaning, since this is a storytelling lens, use your composition to help tell a story. That might mean showing negative space, or it might mean filling the frame. You might use repetition and patterns, or leading lines. Some of my favorite composition techniques are using leading lines, because I think it's a way to add depth with the 35 when you don't have as much depth of field from the focal length. And then another composition technique that I use with this lens is layering. If you have multiple subjects, you have a foreground, middle ground, background subject, and that's another way to kind of add depth with the 35. In summary, let me just run through the pros and cons of the 35. I shoot with the 35 a lot because the 35 focal length is so versatile and I can do a lot of different things with it, from photojournalism at weddings, to travel, to adventure storytelling and environmental portraits. Since it's a prime lens, it's fast at low aperture. So even though there's not a lot of bokeh, depth of field, or background separation with this lens, there are other reasons we want low aperture, such as shooting in low light. So that's another thing that makes this a great lens for photojournalism. You can shoot in pretty much any conditions as it performs well in low light. Now, when I want bokeh and depth of field, background separation, I'm going to switch to my 50 or 85 millimeter lenses. I'll also use those lenses if I know I'm not going to be able to get close enough to my subjects with the 35. For whatever reason, maybe it's the setting or because it's not appropriate, or maybe it's because you're feeling too shy. And then at other times, the 35 millimeters is just not wide enough for the impact that I want from a landscape or architectural image. In which case I'll switch to my much heavier but beloved 16 to 35. In summary, I shoot with this lens a lot, and often if I can only bring one lens, this is the one. But for how versatile it is, there are some things it can't do, which is why I can't help but walk around with multiple lenses. Thanks so much for listening and learning. I hope you're excited to shoot with your 35. See you next time.